Hi, I'm Professor McCoy, and today we're going to talk about hylomorphic dualism. Now, hylomorphic dualism is sort of a breakaway conversation from what we've discussed before, which is the Aristotelian idea of the soul. Specifically, hylomorphic dualism is an application of this to the field of the philosophy of mind. So we're going to specifically be talking about the human soul here. So throughout this video, just to note, I'm going to be using the term mind and soul pretty much interchangeably in this discussion. And that's because in the context of hylomorphic dualism and in the context of the philosophy of mind, we're talking specifically about human souls, which is to say rational souls. So we're talking about the rational part here, which we can just as easily refer to as the mind. Throughout the course of this video, I'm going to be, since it's in this context of the current philosophy of mind, I'm going to be comparing hylomorphic dualism, which is roughly speaking the Aristotelian, or we might say the Thomistic view or the scholastic view, with two other primary views in the philosophy of mind, which are materialism and Cartesian dualism. There are additional views that are around the contemporary philosophy of mind that I will mention briefly as we go through, but I'm not going to focus on them as heavily. I'm just going to go into the basics and the other two major views. However, if you do hear any of these other views that you might want to hear more about, or you might want to hear me discuss, feel free to comment and let me know, and I'd be happy to go in and do a more in-depth discussion of any of these others as well. But for now, I want to focus on hylomorphic dualism and how it compares to materialism and Cartesian dualism. So for that, I want to look at, I want to go back for a moment to a bit of Aristotelian metaphysics, which is hylomorphism, which is the composite of form and matter. So for Aristotle, any given substance or any given thing is a composite of its matter and its form, right? So its material cause, what it's made of, the material it's made of, and its form, which is what form or what shape or what configuration that matter takes. So this is, we can say, the material element and the immaterial element, what gives the matter, what makes the matter the kind of thing that it is. For living things, and especially for rational animals like human beings, we call this form the soul. So, applying this to the philosophy of mind, we can take this view and develop from it what's called hylomorphic dualism. And this really just contextualizes it in the discussion in the philosophy of mind between materialism, dualism, and at the other end, idealism as well, which is that everything is mind. The term hylomorphic dualism was coined by philosopher David Oderberg to sort of do what I've just been talking about, right? To contextualize this Aristotelian view within the broader discussion of contemporary philosophy of mind. So what characterizes hylomorphic dualism as a point of view within this discussion? Well, to see that, I think it'll help to look at the alternatives as points of contrast. So we'll begin with looking at materialism. So there are various kinds of materialism, but they all share the common element that says that everything that exists is physical or material. They deny the formal element, or at least deny that the formal element has any real ontological status, deny that it really exists as anything more than a way of describing something that's really fundamentally material or physical. So other names for this view, you might hear physicalism as well. Physicalism, or we might even say that it's a kind of naturalism, as a way of excluding the non-material, the non-physical, or the supernatural, all of which we could use, at least in some context, to describe the soul. So among materialists, we have reductive and non-reductive versions of materialism or physicalism. The reductive kind say that anything that you can describe, which includes the mental elements, the apparently immaterial mental elements, things like thought, things like experience, things like reason, things like abstract universals, all of these things can be fully described by purely material characteristics. So we can describe, for instance, pain in terms of certain fibers, or certain neurons in the brain or in the nervous system firing. And that's simply what it means, what pain means. For another example, we can describe thoughts truly and fully. We can fully describe what a thought is by referring to the material neurons and their configuration, how they're firing. This is similar to how we might want to say we can describe a computer program in terms of the hardware states of say, the computer that it's written on. Or we can fully describe the words on a page, like the meaning of the words on a page. We can fully describe that by the configuration of the ink and how it's laid out. Now, non-reductive materialism or non-reductive physicalism says that everything about what appears to be immaterial, so everything about mind, everything about the world of thoughts and ideas and concepts, can be described in terms of material, right, purely material things, but that there is real meaning to the non-physical descriptions that we ordinarily give, right? So we might say that, there's that pain is, certain neurons in the brain and in the nervous system firing. We might say that that's really what pain is, but that's not what we ordinarily mean by pain. When I say I'm in pain, I'm not straightforwardly describing, I'm not just simply describing that I have certain neurons firing. I'm describing a sensation, which, while it is ultimately describable in physical terms, it means something somewhat different. I'm referring to the sensation. I'm referring to what appears to be a non-physical thing, even though it's fully describable in physical terms. But what's common to all of these is that anything that we describe as mental or what we might call non-physical really has a fully material basis, and that it's fully describable in terms of the physical. So, in other words, everything that exists is fundamentally physical. Okay. So this is, again, a very brief description, and there are other forms of materialism as well. We have emergent materialism, which also might be called epiphenomenalism, which is that these non-physical characteristics are really only can be described in non-physical terms, but they are fully dependent upon the material that makes them up, or something like that. That these non-physical descriptions are what we call epiphenomena. They're phenomena that are fully caused by the material processes. Just like we might say that the decision of a group of people is fully describable in terms of the decisions by the individuals, but we mean something more than that when we say it was the group's decision. That's the general idea. Now, on the other hand, we have Cartesian dualism. And this is the view put forward primarily by René Descartes, which is that the human being is fundamentally an immaterial thinking thing, so a soul. And that the other component of this thing is the body, right? So that the physical, extended material body, right? The thing that takes up space. So we have fundamentally here two different substances. We have the soul, which is immaterial, doesn't take up any space, doesn't have any material components. It's purely simple. It's a simple, indivisible thing. And it has no physical interactions. Right? So it's not like it's a ghost that can knock things over. Right? It's only physical interactions through the body that it's linked to. So that is its own substance, right? Hence, Cartesian dualism is sometimes referred to as substance dualism, right? Which means that there are two kinds of things, material things and immaterial or mental things. So on that hand, you have the soul, which is purely immaterial. It has no physical component to it. And on the other hand, you have the body, which is an inert, physical, extended thing, right? That, in the case of human beings at least, this immaterial soul interacts with and controls. So, on the Cartesian view, the immaterial soul and the physical body interact, but it is fundamentally the immaterial soul which is properly described as a self, or as a human being, or as a person. Right? The body in this case is something that the self or something that the soul interacts with. It's a separate substance. Now you can point to someone or refer to the person, but that's sort of like pointing to a car and saying, that guy cut me off. Well, the car is what moved in front of you, and the person is just driving it. This is sort of like the idea that that Descartes has about the relationship between mind and body, or soul and body, which is that the soul sort of pilots the body, and it sees the world as it's represented by the body. And so the body is responsible for perception, for sense perception. The eyes see, and that gives inputs to the nervous system. And that the soul sees or comprehends this, the representation of the external world that the body presents to it. So there's a gap here between the soul and the external world. This gives rise to the Cartesian problem of skepticism, which and Descartes' reasons for doubting the veracity of our sense perceptions, and the reason for initially doubting the existence of the external world. That, of course, is a topic for another video, but it all comes back to this view of the mind and the body as being entirely separate substances. Okay, so by contrast to both of these views, what is hylomorphic dualism? This is the Aristotelian view that the substance, the thing, right, me, for example, that I, the person sitting here speaking to you, am composed of both form and matter, right? That is to say, I am a soul and body composite. I'm not just a soul with a body, and I'm not just a body with characteristics which can be described as mental, say. I am this composite being. If I were just my body and my soul weren't part of me, I would be dead. And that's what it means for something to be dead, if you recall from the previous video. So, a body without a soul, we can't have this possibility on a hylomorphic view. On the other hand, you can't have a soul without a body and say that's just, me without my body, right? The soul without the body is at most an incomplete substance, right? It's not the whole person. Now I'll note, and again, this may wind up being a topic for another video, that Aristotle and those going forward in the Aristotelian tradition, especially including the scholastics, did hold that the human soul, or the rational part of the human soul, was strictly immaterial and could exist separate from the body. But importantly, that soul, that immaterial soul, existing apart from the body, could not be considered the whole person. That was an incomplete or separated substance. That's part of it separated out from the whole. And it's this form-matter composite, body and soul together, or the body and mind even together, that forms the whole person. So on an Aristotelian point of view, it doesn't make sense to make a distinction between me and my body. So, for example, to distinguish these things maybe a little better. Go to maybe a common or popular example. C.S. Lewis made the statement something along the lines of, I don't have a soul. I am a soul, and I have a body. This is a fairly straightforward presentation of the Cartesian dualist point of view. However, it is not, it's very different from the hylomorphic point of view, which isn't that I am a soul, I have a body. It's also not that I am a body and I have a soul, or I am a body and I can be described in mental terms, or I am a body that has thoughts. Rather, for the Aristotelian or Thomistic hylomorphic dualist, I am a body and soul. Right? I am my body, I am my soul. The two things are parts of the same union, right? The parts of the same whole substance. You might otherwise say that they're describing different aspects of the same thing, right? So if I were to describe, say, my height, I'm 6'1". What that means is I'm describing the height of my body, right? But we wouldn't say, my body is 6'1". We would say I'm 6'1", and that's an accurate description because we're describing something about me, but we're describing a corporeal aspect of me, right? I'm not describing a mental aspect of me, right? To ask how tall is your mind just simply doesn't make sense. Right? The problem, though, is if you ask that to a Cartesian, right? If you were to ask how tall are you, you'd either have to mean how tall is your body and mean you're asking about something separate to your real self, or you'd be asking something that you can't answer because the mind isn't extended, it doesn't take up space, it doesn't have a height. Similarly, on the Aristotelian view, you can ask questions of, say, what are your thoughts on say a recent election, right? What are your thoughts on this? Or what do you think of Plato's view on the soul, by contrast? Or what do you think of the idea of materialism? Right? So these are thoughts, right? These are immaterial things. That's a way of describing me, right? That's a way of describing my thoughts. They really are as much a part of me on the hylomorphic view as my height. Now, for the Cartesian dualist, these are the only real parts of me, right? My thoughts, what my immaterial mind, what I think, what I believe, what I conceptualize. For the materialist, though, these thoughts aren't, they're describing me, but in a limited sense. At most, they're describing what arises from a particular set of neurons, or what arises from a particular causal process that's going on in my brain and nervous system. Taken more reductively, it's simply describing the configuration of the electricity in my nervous system. Right? So in that case, it's not really describing anything about the recent election, or anything about Plato's view of the soul, or anything about materialism. They're describing just configurations of neurons, or configurations of electricity, electrical signals, that sort of thing. So, what benefits does hylomorphic dualism have over these other schools of thought? Well, as I just alluded to, hylomorphic dualism makes more sense of descriptions of thought as such. Right? So we can describe thoughts on a materialist view, but only in a really distant sense. Right? We can describe them as an emergent phenomenon if we're talking about epiphenomenalism. We can describe them as a kind of shorthand description for a physical process if we're talking about non-reductive physicalism. Or we can describe them in terms of simply neurons firing if we're talking about reductive physicalism. But the issue with this is that that's generally not what we're talking about when we refer to thoughts. And none of those have any kind of causal power, right? The neurons firing can cause things to happen, but it's not the content of the thought that's causing something to happen. This is an even worse problem for non-reductive kinds of physicalism, especially epiphenomenalism, because these thoughts aren't actually what, if by thoughts we mean the epiphenomena, the phenomena that arises from the neurons firing, right? It's not the thought or the content of the thought that's causing anything, right? So if I think I'm thirsty and so I reach to have a drink, right? What's causing me to get a drink isn't the thought or isn't the experience of thirst, right? It's the neurons. It's the lower level description of what's going on that's actually doing the causation, right? Hylomorphic dualism doesn't have this problem because our thoughts and our mental states are just as much a part of ourselves as our neurons are. They're just described in a different way, right? So we can describe things in terms of their material cause, which is the neurons and the way that they're firing and their configuration and the electrical signals passing around, that sort of thing. Or we can describe our minds in terms of thoughts and abstractions. And so an experience of thirst has a formal cause, which is the thought of that I'm thirsty, whereas it has the material cause of, certain neurons firing. That's the mental description and the corporeal description. But they're really the same thing. They're both me. Now, on the other side, we can look to some issues with Cartesian-style dualism that hylomorphism doesn't have an issue with. And this is especially the mind-body problem, or the interaction problem, which is that if the mind is purely immaterial, and it doesn't seem to interact with anything except the body, how does it interact with the body if the body is purely physical? Because if we have physical things and we have mechanical descriptions of how physical things interact with one another, we have things like the law of conservation of energy. So it seems that we can't have the body being caused by something immaterial if the body is fully describable in physical terms. Right? If the body is fully describable in physical terms, then the body is essentially a reductive physicalist, is describable in reductive physicalist terms. Right? It's describable without recourse to the soul. So all of the things that the body does don't require the soul to explain it, don't require the mind to explain it. If it does require the mind to explain it, then the only way that we have to describe effects on a physical thing, on the Cartesian model, are physical. So we can't have an explanation for how this immaterial mind moves the physical body. If we want to put this in very simplistic terms, we can point to the problem of, well, if the mind has no extension, if it doesn't take up space, that means it doesn't have mass. Something without mass or energy, in the physical sense, can't have an effect on something physical. It can't have a physical effect if it isn't physical. Hylomorphism, again, doesn't have this problem. Because the mind and body aren't separate things, we don't have to explain how they interact, because all you need to describe is how I act. Me, the physical and non-physical substance. This substance which has both physical and mental characteristics. What we're describing isn't how my mind affects my body, but rather how I act using mind and body. Right? So they interact in the same way that form and matter interact in any other way, right? The form or the immaterial part, the soul, gives shape to and gives causes to and gives ends to the material part. So the thought I have that I'm thirsty does really explain why I reach to my left to grab a glass and take a sip. right? It explains why I do this. Because my body, in this case, is acting to fulfill the ends presented to it by the mind, right? So the mind, which is the formal cause, presents a final cause to the material cause, which is the body, the material of the body. And then the body reaches over and thus becomes the efficient cause of the glass moving towards my mouth and me rehydrating, say. So we see we don't have the same kind of interaction problem with the hylomorphic view. Now, on perhaps a side note, it's interesting that the mind-body problem, or the interaction problem, is the major problem for dualistic metaphysics in the modern context. And that's because dualism in the modern context is typically some form of Cartesian dualism, which separates the two, the mind and body, into separate substances. And since they're separate substances, they have to interact in some way. But we don't have a model by which they can interact, right? Because if the body, again, is purely physical, then we have this problem of an immaterial thing interacting with a material thing, which seems to violate physical principles. The mind-body problem doesn't even occur to a hylomorphic dualist, other than it being sort of in the philosophical discussion. Because there's no interaction really to deal with. It's merely the action of a single substance acting in a certain way, right? Acting under certain descriptors, acting under mental or corporeal descriptors. So, what are problems we might have for the hylomorphic dualist? Well, first of all, and most apparent, is that it depends fundamentally on an Aristotelian metaphysics. Right? So if you reject final causes, say, which most physicalists do, which is generally a large part of the modern project, is dispensing with final causes and describing things in terms of efficient and material causes. So if you don't subscribe to a very Aristotelian metaphysics, this interaction, or this, we might say, this action of formal and material causes, this action of mind and body, doesn't fit into our metaphysical framework. So it really is a whole package deal that you are forced to accept if you want to use this as a solution, or if you want to take this on as a piece of philosophy of mind. And that has all sorts of other implications, which, again, are far more than we can dive into in just one video. Another issue is the fear that it collapses into one or another view. So there's a fear that it can collapse into materialism, or at least a kind of epiphenomenalism, or maybe even just property dualism. Because if we say that what we're describing here is the same thing under two aspects, or the same thing described in two different ways, the materialist can argue, well, what you're doing is you're describing the phenomenon, which is physical, and the epiphenomena, which appear to be non-physical, right? So it's the mental states which just arise from the physical states, right? You've already stated, right, the hylomorphic dualist has already stated that that we have a physical material cause, which is the body, and we also have this formal cause that sort of rests on top of it, and both describe roughly the same thing. So you can say that this just sort of this dissolves into a kind of physicalism with a non-physical descriptor for some of the things that are going on that can be described physically. Another way that this might fall apart is to say, well, what is the formal cause? What is this rational soul? Especially if you focus on what is this rational soul that is purely immaterial. Right? Because again, I want to note, Aristotle thinks that part of the rational soul, the active intellect is what he calls it, is fundamentally immaterial and doesn't rely upon the body. It doesn't rely upon the body to exist. It can, in principle, exist independently. So the Cartesian dualist will point to this and say that doesn't interact with the body in the same way that most forms interact with their material. So we can point, the Cartesian dualist can point and say there must be then some kind of, in principle at least, separation between the two, and so we have this interaction problem. So it doesn't solve the Cartesian interaction problem as well as the Aristotelian might claim that hylomorphic dualism does. Now again, there are solutions proposed for these problems, and I will put a link to Oderberg's original paper, which coined this term, in the description as well. So if you are looking for further resources, I'll have that and a couple of other things in the description for you to check into. But I hope that so far we've had a pretty good overview of hylomorphic dualism, and especially how it compares to these two other major views in the philosophy of mind. I also haven't gone into detail on idealism. The main reason, which I'll say, idealism is the idea that everything is mental, right? That the physical is really just another way of describing the mental, right? So that everything is a part of a mind or the idea of a mind. This is especially as espoused by Berkeley. I haven't gone into this in nearly as much detail, primarily because it's not as common in the contemporary discussion. But it could be something else that I can touch on in another video. But regardless, what I hope to do here is just provide an overview of the competing ideas and how hylomorphic dualism compares with what I think are the two major competitors in the philosophy of mind, which are materialism and Cartesian dualism. So with that, I hope the discussion has been pretty productive, and I will see you next time.